Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your coming. So before I start today's class, let me just let you know we are going to have a makeup exam for midterm 2 for students who miss exam. Okay, so this is going to be happen on this Thursday night, right? So I'm going to send you email. Send email to everybody to let you know. So we are going to have a makeup exam for midterm 2. Okay, so this is only for makeup. All right. The other things I want to emphasize is, so when you work on your midterm or future exams, make sure you submit on time. Otherwise, you're going to get an incomplete grade. All right. So that's regarding to the exam. Okay. So now let's quickly review what we have learned so far. Okay, so this is regarding to module 3, and particularly this is regarding to last week, right? So I'm just going to review where we have learned so that we can continue our discussion. Okay, so basically we are in a module that understand what determines GDP, right? So that's the main things we are focusing on in this module, right? And here, so we are going to start with a simple model, which is income expenditure model, right? And basically from this, from name, you can tell. So here we are going to see how income is going to determine expenditure, right? But essentially, because expenditure is one of the 3 ways to look at the GDP, okay? So in that sense, that just tells you, okay, so we are going to look at income affect expenditure, and the expenditure is going to determine GDP, so you're going to see a loop, right? And this loop is going to determine by the equation we have seen earlier. So y equal to c of y plus I of y, right? So I may write slightly different versions. So essentially, total expenditure equal to C as a function of income, plus I as a function of income. Okay. So and then, so what's the difference here? So on the top, let's just call it 2, equation 2. On the bottom, equation 1. Right. So in the bottom, equation 1. So that's just one equation, one unknown. Right? So this is the equation regarding to y. What is y? Y is the GDP or real GDP. So that's what we are looking after, right? And so in equation 2, so that reflects to the income expenditure equilibrium. Okay, let's go to here, income expenditure, right? So how we understand this income expenditure? So first, so income is going to determine your consumer spending. Income is going to determine investment spending. So this is income, right? And secondly, where does expenditure coming from? Expenditure just says, oh, so C plus I, that's going to give us, so these 2 items is going to give us the aggregate expenditure. But what is aggregate expenditure? And then just remember, so we have 3 different ways to look at GDP, right? So GDP, you can look at GDP through expenditure, through income, or through product. Right? So in that sense, we replace expenditure here with y, income here with y. So that's going to return to equation 1. Right? So that's the logic. That's how we look at the determination of GDP through this income expenditure approach. And then graphically, how we are going to do, so we are going to write C as a function of income. So here we write real GDP, but this is just look at income because income equal to real GDP. And we look at I blended as a function of real GDP, but again, this is income. We add them together, that's going to give you the aggregate expenditure. But this aggregate expenditure is going to give us the GDP. Okay, but then so we are going to look at a particular point. So when the 45-degree line cross with this aggregate expenditure line, and then so here, so they cross each other. So when they cross each other, we are in equilibrium. And why is that? Just imagine, so if we have produced too much. Like in this case, we produce 2,500. Okay, so that's above this cross. If that's the case, and then you can see the aggregate expenditure is below 45-degree line, meaning so aggregate, let me write it here. So aggregate expenditure is less than what we produced. Okay, that's called GDP. Okay, so if that's the case, that just means the firm, the business is going to pile up with inventory. So this unplanned inventory is going to be positive. So essentially, just think about Apple. They produce too many iPhones. They cannot sell their iPhone. Okay, or so the business they have bought too many candies, and it turns out nobody want to go trick or treat during this past weekend. Okay, and then they cannot sell their candy. So the unplanned inventory investment is going to go up. Why? Is because we produce too much. If that's the case, the business want to get rid of the inventory. Think about iPhone, if they produce too many iPhones. So the way they reduce is, sorry, the way they maintain or to contain their unplanned inventory investment is either to sell at a low price or they adjust their production in a future period. So that just means that's going to move to the left hand side. Okay, so because we produce too much. On the other hand, so if the adjustment becomes too aggressive, or in other words, we becomes too pessimistic, and we move to the right hand side of this cross, okay, so we only produce 1,000. So now suddenly, so the demand, the aggregate expenditure exceeds GDP. So because it's above 45 degree, right? So if that is the case, meaning so the business is going to run out of inventory very quickly. They cannot satisfy the demand from the households. Okay, if that is the case, so they may adjust their business by expanding their business. So they produce more. So they're going to move to the right hand side, right? To bring them together, you can see either we are on the right hand side to this cross, there's force that's going to bring down the production. Or if we on the right hand, if you are on the left hand side, okay, so this on the right hand side, this on the left hand side. If we on the left hand side, meaning we produce too little, so then there are forces going to bring up the production. Okay, so in either case, until we reach the middle point, when we call the Keynesian cross. Okay, so this named after Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, that's considered as the founding father of modern macroeconomics, as we discussed in the introduction. Okay, until we reach this Keynesian cross, and then there will be no adjustment. No one wants to adjust their plan. All right, so this is how we reach the equilibrium. But please keep in mind, we make a tons of assumptions here. Okay, so just name a few. So number one, so here demand determines everything, right? So all the adjustment coming from demand. And the secondly, all the adjustment was caused by demand. Okay, so secondly, so we simplify no government, no rest of the world, or no import and export. And third, here we keep price as given. And here, what is the price? Price is the aggregate price. As you're going to see later, essentially, this is the price of interest rate. Okay, so those the assumptions we have made. Okay, and then after we wrap up this part of the slides, when we move to the next chapter, so we are going to relax those assumptions one by one, right? Okay, so given this diagram, so this pretty much just summarize what we have learned. Okay, given this diagram, so we can see these practice questions, right? So basically, so point C, that's the equilibrium. Anything on the left hand side, meaning we produce too little, so you're going to move to the right hand side. Everything on the right hand side, we produce too much, and then there's going to adjustment, move to the left hand side. Okay, until we reach the middle point. Okay. And here, so in this slide, that's going to give you the answers to the discussion for the previous slide, right? Now, we need to understand what can cause a shift of the planned aggregate spending line. Or in other words, let's just go back. So we need to understand what can cause this line to shift, go up or goes down. Right? So we need to understand what are the factors leads to adjustment of this aggregate expenditure line. But keep in mind there are two items inside this aggregate expenditure. One is consumption or consumer spending. The other is investment. Okay, so the factor cause this line to move must coming from the force that cause either the consumer adjust their spending or the business adjust their investment. All right, so that's what we are going to do. Oh, by the way, so you may want to know, so we sometimes we may move along this line. Okay, so what causes a move along this line? That's going to cause by changing your real income. Okay. Now let's see what caused the shift. Okay. So there are two possible sources of a shift. Okay. And of course, there are other sources. But here, let's just focus on two of them. Number one, there's a change in interest rate. Okay, so again, so interest rate is just a price of investing. Okay, think about buy a mortgage. Sorry, think about use a mortgage to buy a house, right? Or think about to take a loan to buy a car. The other factor can cause shift in the planned aggregate spending line is changing wealth. Okay, so what is considered as your wealth? Think about your house, think about your stocks you invest in the market, okay? Also including your cash, right? So these two things is going to cause the shift of the aggregate spending line, okay? So why this, oh, sorry. So let's go back to previous one. Let me explain to you why this can cause a shift. So start with interest rate. So as I just explained to you, interest rate is the price of investing. So if interest rate goes up, meaning it's more expensive to invest, and then the investment will go down, right? And the wealth. So wealth, just imagine, so if there's a housing market bust, like actually look at this background picture. So there's like a foreclosure boat tour. Essentially, it's because of the housing market bust, and then some people is going to trying to looking for bargain in the collapsed housing market, right? But certainly, so if there's a housing market collapse, and then your wealth is going to decline, right? And then so the decline of your wealth is going to reduce your incentive to consumption or investing, right? So that's why, so the change in wealth or changes in interest rate is going to have an impact on the aggregate spending line through C and through I. Okay. All right. So here, so we are going to see a similar multiplier as we have seen earlier. Right? And here, this is a multiplier happens when change in inventory, right? When inventory changes, and then there's going to adjustment on the aggregate expenditure, but that's going to have a multiplier effect. And this multiplier effect largely coming from MPA, MPC, right? So that's what we discussed earlier. Now let's see how this multiplier effect will pan out, okay? All right, so continue our previous example we have seen, okay? So the effect of autonomous increase in planned aggregate expenditure of 400, okay? So if this is 400, right? So what this slide just tells you is, so this is before we have adjustment in autonomous spending change, right? So what is autonomous? Essentially, this is C equal to A plus MPC times Y. And A is the autonomous, right? If we look at this slide, and particularly the second column, you can see the autonomous spending is 800. Now the last column just tells you, so for some reason, there's changes in autonomous spending, okay? And this increased to 1200. Okay? What caused this increase in autonomous spending? It could be because of GDP, economic growth, standard of living increase, okay? And the people find out, so we requires more to provide as a minimum level of consumption, right? Or it's because of the inflation. Everything becomes relatively more expensive, right? And then so we want to spend more on the necessity, right? So that's considered as autonomous spending. For whatever reason it is, so now here we are interested to see a change in autonomous spending. How would that affect changing Y? So here I would denote as Y star. Okay, so this Y star just denote this is an equilibrium income level or equilibrium expenditure level coming out of the income expenditure model, right? Now let's see. So first of all, so we are going to compare two things. One is real GDP, the other is aggregate expenditure. Let me erase everything. Okay. So after the change, okay, after the change or before the change, so we are going to look at the row that real GDP equal to your aggregate expenditure. So before the change, so that's given by this row. And after the change, that's going to be given by this row. So now we are going to look at first and third column. Okay, and so you can see, so a 400 increase. So by the way, so this 400 increase in autonomous spending leads to 1,000 increase in Y star. Again, so what is Y star? Y star is the level of GDP or level of income or level of aggregate expenditure that comes out of the income expenditure model, right? But clearly you can see there is a multiplier, right? So you only increase autonomous spending by 400, nothing else. But the net impact on the economy is going to be more than 400. Is equal to 1,000, right? So what is behind that? Just remind yourself the multiplier. So how the multiplier works. So if you have increase in spending by $1 for someone in the economy, and then so this $1 increase becomes immediate. So the aggregate expenditure increased by $1. But there's a chain effect. So you increase your consumption by $1. And this $1 becomes to the second person's income. And then the second person is going to increase spending by MPC amount. And then so on and so forth, right? And similarly here, so we increase autonomous spending by 400. But this 400 becomes to somebody else's income. And then so somebody else who received this 400 billions increase in consumption. And then they are going to spend. Spend how much? A fraction of 400 multiplied by MPC, and so on and so forth. And then so we are going to see the entire process happen as a consequence of this 400 increase in autonomous spending will lead to an aggregate expenditure increase by 1,000. Okay. So this is represented by this graph, right? So before we have the adjustment. So this line tells us how aggregate expenditure is going to adjust with income. And this line has an intersection of 800, that's autonomous spending. And in this line, you can easily find out that line has a slope of 0.6, right? and how we find out the slope of this line. So the difference between, so the difference here is 2,000 minus 800 equal to 1,200. And then the distance between here and here, this is 2,000, right? So from 0 to 2,000, this is 2,000. And then slope of this line equal to 1,200 divided by 2,000 equal to 0.6. But this slope exactly gives us MPC, right? And given the existence of MPC, so you can see there's a chain rule. Once we increase the aggregate, sorry, the autonomous spending by 400, right? Okay, so you're going to see there's an adjustment, right? And at the end of the day, so we're going to see a new equilibrium, right? By the way, how this happens? This happens with the following, right? So let's just erase everything, and then so we can see the adjustment better. So originally we are here, we are in equilibrium, y equal to 2,000, right? And so originally, so the aggregate expenditure is 2,000. But because of the increase in autonomous spending, okay, and then so you're going to find out, so immediately before we do anything, so the aggregate expenditure will increase to 24. So that just means there's an unplanned inventory decline of 400, right? So suddenly the demand exceeds supply. And then how the economy is going to adjust, they are going to increase the production until we reach this new point, right? Until we reach this new point, okay? And then once within this new point, you're going to see, so the demand equal to supply, right? But then, so the horizontal difference is going to determine by the multiplier. And the multiplier is going to determine by the slope of this aggregate expenditure function, right? Okay, and then so given this discussion, we can see the paradox of thrifting. Okay, and in the previous slides, you can see is if I spend $1 more towards end, so the impact on the economy is going to larger than this $1, right? So there's a multiplier. And then conversely, if I reduce my consumption by $1, and then so the net impact on the economy is going to more than $1, right? Because of this domino effect. Because if I stop to go shopping in the shopping mall, and then so the owners of the store, they're going to have a reduced income. They are going to cut their spending. They may stop to go to dining out, and then so on and so forth, right? So this is a paradox of thrifting. Okay. So let's just read the last sentence. If everyone else do the same, meaning, so I respond by a downtime or response by a recession with cutting spending, and then the economy is depressed, jobs are lost, and everyone is worse off because of their virtuous individual action. So here meaning, so from your individual point of view, it is optimal, but from the aggregate point of view, it becomes detrimental. So we are in the perfect time to understand this paradox of thrifting, right? So far, so we have more than 11 million people lost their job in this year. Okay, so there are 11 million Americans lost their job due to the pandemic. Okay, and so as a natural response, the individual who lost their job or who is afraid of losing their job, so they should cut the spending, save a little more to prepare the worst to come. But however, if everybody do this, think about this is a large group, right? 11 million. And plus, there are people who may has possibility of losing their job. So this problem is way bigger than 11 million, probably like 15 million. Okay? If every of those individuals cut their spending, even by a tiny fraction, so that's going to has a drastically impact on the aggregate demand. So the demand is going to weak, so that's going to lead a lot of business going to close, right? Even though, so we let them to open, even though, so we allow them to operate, right? So that justify why the government passed this CARES Act. Okay, so this CARES Act provides support to households. They provide free checks to households. They provide extended and more generous unemployment benefit to households. So this is designed to lift up consumer confidence, so that their virtual individual action won't cause severe damage to the economy. Okay, from their individual point of view, it is optimal, but there's unintended consequence to the aggregate economy. Okay, so this is paradox of thrifting. And we can look at the multiplier, okay, and particularly multiplier at the end of recession, right? And so this is one episode of the recession. Okay, so we are going to look at three things: real GDP, consumer spending, and inventory. Okay, so real GDP, look at it here, start to decline and then to pick up, right? And so the decline in real GDP, and as a consequence, so the consumer spending is going to decline, and the decline in consumer spending leads to a negative inventory, right? And then so later it's going to pick up, right? So why does it pick up? Because the consumers start to gain. So I mean, toward the end of the recession, consumers start to gain confidence, and then the pick up, and then so this consumer spending pick up leads to the inventory decline even further, right? Right. So I'm going to stop this part of the slides with a case study. So this is in 2009. Okay? So in the worst day of the Great Recession in 2009. In the US, there was a discussion: should we bail out GM, which is stands for General Motors, right? Should we bail out the GM or let GM bankrupt, right? Okay, so and then so here's a discussion. Someone may say, okay, GM's problem is self-made because they did not keep up with innovation. Okay, so they did not push hard enough to meet the demand of the market. So that's why their sales decline and they cannot survive. But someone else thinks so the GM problem is because the GM was a victim of a poor economy. And how we understand that? So by looking at these diagram. So on the horizontal line, we have time from 2000 to 2013. Vertical line is auto sales. So this auto sales for the entire industry, not only GM. And then we can see, so there's a sharp decline during 2008. Okay, and so this declined by almost more than 50%, because this the peak days like 18, the worst days around 10. It's more than 50%. And I want to call this sharp decline. This is because of the recession, right? So remember, so we have C equal to A plus MPC times Y. So in 2008, so there's sharp decline in income. So that leads to the sharp decline in C, right? And the C includes vehicles, right? So the households reduce their spending on vehicles. So in that sense, the GM is a victim of the poor economy. So then the people argue, so we should rescue GM because so that's not GM's self-made problem. It's an economy-wide problem, right? And then they reasoning further. So by rescuing GM, so we save jobs. Okay, jobs in that sector. So the saved job is going to boost up spending. Okay, so this is going to have a virtual cycle instead of a virtual cycle. Okay, in terms of actually, so after GM was built out, the recovery in Michigan, that's where GM factory was located. So their unemployment decline is more significant compared to the rest of the country. Largely reflects this demand effect, right? Because so GM was saved and the job was saved, and the household they able to restore their consumption. Okay, and then so if the household restore their consumption, and then so that's going to chain rule, so that's going to save the rest of the economy. So that's why the unemployment recovered faster in Michigan compared to other states who wasn't built out. Okay, so that is this chapter. So now we are ready to move to the next chapter. So in the next chapter, we are going to look at demand and supply altogether. Just keep in mind, in this chapter, we look at the determination of output, which is GDP, through the lens of demand. Now, in the next chapter, we are going to look at demand and supply all together, okay? And we also want to see, so the determination of price. But again, what is the price? Price essentially is interest rate, okay? So that's what we are going to discuss in this coming chapter, right? So this is lecture 11, all right. Okay, so first let's look at the roadmap of this chapter, right? So again, so your textbook may have slightly different titles, okay? But the key things here is we look at demand and supply in a unified framework. Okay? So we are going to look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply separately. Okay? So in that sense, this is very similar to demand and supply we discussed in the review of micro. But here, so we look at aggregate. Okay, we look at aggregate. After we look at aggregate, we are going to look at this demand and supply model. Okay, and here we want to separate between long run versus short run. And particularly, you're going to see, so the behavior of supply curve will be different in terms of time horizon you consider, whether it's a long run or it's a short run, right? And after we understand this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, so we are ready to understand so how monetary policy and fiscal policy can stabilize the economy. And this naturally leads us to the final module, so in which we are going to look at monetary policy and fiscal policy in detail. Okay? So this is the roadmap of this chapter. Now let's start with aggregate demand. Okay? Oh, by the way, so this chapter is going to help us understand how the economy is going to respond a shock to the system. And this chapter is going to help us understand what causes recession, but essentially it's a shock. And why is inflation high in some recession and not others? So this is regarding to price level, right? Okay, so or in other words, so this chapter is going to help us understand the business cycle fluctuation in labor, in output, in price. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in this chapter. Okay, let's start with aggregate demand. Okay. So the aggregate demand curve is going to show the relationship between aggregate demand. Okay, so here is represent real GDP again. So GDP equal to expenditure, income, product. So expenditure, you can understand this is demand. Product, you can understand this is supply. All right? Okay, so now here, so when we look at demand, we just look at expenditure. But in equilibrium, so that's going to be equal to real GDP. So that's why we use real GDP on the horizontal line. And so this aggregate demand curve is the relationship between real GDP or aggregate demand versus aggregate price level, right? I want to remind you, so we have looked at a couple of different measures for aggregate price, including CPI, including PPI, including GDP deflator, right? So those are the price index we have a look at. Okay, so this aggregate demand curve present a downward slope, meaning the higher the price leads to lower demand. Okay? But we need to understand what caused this relationship, right? Or lower the price leads to higher demand. We need to understand what is behind this inverse relationship or this downward slope of the aggregate demand, right? So I want to stop for a few minutes as we usually do, and then so we continue our discussion.